Hi, I'm Hadav from Port. In this video, we're going to take a close look at one of Port's main pillars, self-service actions. Now, actions in Port are one of the main ways to accommodate and simplify your developers' day-to-day routines, allowing them to be much more productive and independent. Port provides you with the tools that you need to create your own actions, implementing any logic you wish, from scaffolding new services, to creating cloud resources, to provisioning temporary environments, and much, much more. Now in this video, we're going to create an action from scratch, and we're going to go step by step, and in each step we're also going to describe the available options to you when creating your own actions. So let's get started. The action we're going to create will demonstrate deployment of a service image to a specified environment. If you want to follow along and create this action in your portal, you will need to complete Port's onboarding process first. If you haven't done so, all you need to do is connect your Git provider to Port. You can do that by going to your builder, click on Data Sources on the left, and let's add a new data source. And under Git Providers, you simply need to choose the Git provider that you're working with, complete the installation, and this will connect Port to your Git provider. And what that will do is it will ingest all of your services or repositories from that Git provider into Port. And in Port, it will create a new blueprint named service, which will represent the services ingested from your Git provider. The second thing you will need is a GitHub repository in which you can create and execute workflows. So now that we have everything set up, let's go ahead and create our action. So in Port, all actions are created and executed from this page, the self-service page. So to create a new action, let's go ahead and click on New Action. And the first thing we're going to do is provide the basic details of this action. So let's go ahead and give it a title. We can also provide a more detailed description. And a nice thing to note here is that the description field also supports links using Markdown. So you could, for example, use this syntax to add a link. Let's just provide that as an example. Next, let's choose an icon. So for this example, I'm going to use the GitHub Actions icon. Next, we need to choose the operation type of the action. So we have three options: create, delete, and day 2. Now, create is the operation type we will use whenever we want our logic to result in a new entity being added to our software catalog. So actions like scaffolding a new service, creating a new Jira issue, these are all things that we want to end up with a new entity in our catalog representing this thing that we created. Next, we have delete. So delete is the exact opposite. It's any logic that will result in deletion of an existing entity in our catalog. And the last type is day 2. Now, day 2 is used to run logic on existing entities in our catalog. So when you don't want your action to create or delete anything, but rather you just want it to run some logic, you will use day 2. So in our case, this fits, right? Because we're not trying to create a new service or something like that. We're using an existing service and deploying an image. So let's go ahead and choose day 2. Next, we need to specify a blueprint. So once we're done creating the action and a user wants to execute it, he will need to choose an entity on which to run this action, right? So when we choose a blueprint here, in our case, let's choose service. When a user wants to execute this action, he will get a drop-down of all the available services and choose one to run this action against. Next, we have conditions. So conditions are used when we want to filter out some of the entities. So maybe you want to have an action that runs on services, but there are specific services that you don't want to be available for this action, so that users can't choose them when executing this action. You can then specify a condition to filter out these entities, so they will not be available for the action. This is a bit more advanced, so if you want to read up on that, go ahead and check out our documentation. So now that we have the basic details set up, let's go ahead and click Next and proceed to the next step, the user form. This is where we define the user inputs of the action, meaning that when a user executes this action, this is the information that he or she needs to provide in order to execute. So in our action, since we're deploying an image to an environment, it makes sense that whenever someone executes this action, he will need to specify which image and which environment. So let's go ahead and create those inputs. So I'll click on New Input, and let's give it a title. We'll call it Image. And we need to specify the input's type. As you can see, there are many, many available types, ranging from strings to numbers to toggles, etc. Now, since this is an introductory video, we're going to keep it as simple as possible, and we're going to choose text. But I just want to say that in a real-world example, or in a real environment, you would probably have a blueprint representing your images, just like we have one for services. You would have a blueprint representing your images, and then you would have your images as entities in your catalog. So once you have that, for an action like this, you could choose entity selection as your type. And what that will do is it would allow the executor of this action to simply select an image from your catalog. So you would get a drop-down with all your available images, which would be much more convenient. But for now, just for the sake of simplicity, let's go ahead and choose text. Now, as you can see, when I selected text, the form changed a little bit. So for each input type, there are different configurations, so the form may change a little bit. So for text, the next thing we want to decide is whether or not this input is required. Now I'm going to set this to true because, of course, it doesn't make a lot of sense to execute this action without specifying which image we're going to deploy. So we want to require the executing user to specify an image. Next, we can provide a more detailed description. We can also choose an icon. And on the bottom here, we have some nice additional configurations. So for example, we can provide a default value for this input. We can also set some constraints, such as minimum or maximum length. And we can also use a regular expression to set some constraints or validations on the input. So we're going to leave these blank for now. So let's go ahead and click Create. Now let's go ahead and create our second input. So we created the image. Now let's do the same for our environment. Again, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to choose text. I'm also going to set this to true. And again, let's leave these blank for now and go ahead and click Create. Great, so now our two inputs are ready and we can proceed to the next step. Before we do that, a quick word about advanced configuration. So Port allows you to create more complex user forms with dynamic fields, fields that depend on other fields, and things like that to create much more complex experiences and support more complex use cases when creating actions. So if you want to read up on that, go ahead and click on the Read More here to go to our docs. And once you're ready, come back here, click Next, and let's proceed to the next step. So now that we have our user form set up and our user inputs, it's time to define the backend. The backend is where the logic will actually run, and this is where we tell Port how and where we're going to trigger the action logic. So when configuring the backend, the first thing you need to choose is an invocation type. You can see the options that Port supports in this list, so let's go over them. First, we have the four major CI/CD platforms, which is GitHub, Jenkins, GitLab, and Azure. Since they each have their own workflow or pipeline mechanisms, then Port can just trigger a workflow or a pipeline that resides in your repositories. Besides that, we also have an option to use a Kafka topic. So port can publish the action to a Kafka topic, and you can handle it there. You can also use a webhook URL. So port can publish the action using a post request to your webhook URL, and you can handle it there. And lastly, we have the create update entity option. So this is when you have an action that doesn't use any complex logic and you just want to update something in your catalog. This is a good option. It's the simplest option to do so. And in our case, for this video, we're going to use a GitHub workflow. So let's choose that. Now, to use a GitHub workflow as an action backend, you need to install Port's GitHub app. It's a very quick installation. Simply install it in your organization, and then Port can automatically fetch your repositories into Port, and then create entities for them. So once you do that, what's left is to tell Port where this workflow is located. So we need to provide an organization, a repo, and a workflow name. So in my case, I will be using my Port samples organization. And for the repository, I'll be using one named Port actions. And then we need to provide the workflow file name. Note that this must reside under .github/workflows. So if I go to my repo, you can see I have a deploy image.yaml workflow. So let's copy that and paste that here. Next, we have report workflow status. So what this does is this determines whether or not Port will use the status from the GitHub workflow itself to update the status of the action in Port. So every time you execute an action run object is created in Port that holds data about the specific execution of the action. So if report workflow status is set to yes, then Port will take the status of the GitHub workflow and automatically set it for the action run in Port. So we're going to leave that as yes for convenience. Scrolling down a bit, you can see that the next step is to configure the payload. Now, a payload is the data that is sent to the backend during each execution of the action. So when you create an action in Port, you also define the payload. You define what data is sent to the backend. So here you can send anything that's available to you, including the inputs or some data about the executing user. So let's dive a bit deeper into that. If I go back to my repo here, I've prepared a simple payload that we can use for now just to better understand how this works. So I'm going to copy that and paste it in my payload here. Now, to better understand this, if I scroll a bit down, I have a test JQ button. This will take us to the JQ playground, where we can test our payload against some sample data. So let's break this down. Port provides us here with some trigger data examples. This is the same structure of the data that will be generated once we execute this action. And this data is available to us when constructing the payload. So anything you see in this example of trigger data can be used in the payload. So again, we have the user inputs of the action. We have some information about the executing user, his ID, email, first name, last name. And if I scroll a bit down, another important piece of data is the run ID. So remember we said that whenever we execute an action, there's an action run for that specific execution. Then that execution has an identifier, a unique identifier that we can later use to interact with this action run. We can send logs back to it, we can send links, we can update its status, and we'll see examples of this later in this video. But going back to the payload. If I scroll a bit further down, I can see that my payload, the one that I just pasted. And then if I scroll down a bit more, I have a test button. Clicking this test button will test this payload against this example data. So let's go ahead and test. And this is a great way to ensure that your payload is valid and that you get the value that you expect to get. So let's see what we did here. In our payload, we specified image, environment, and run ID. So the way this works is it's a JSON object with key value pairs, where the key is the name of the input or the name of the piece of data that you want to send. And then this name is what we later use in the backend to reference this piece of data. And the value is a JQ expression that extracts data from this object that we saw here. So for example, image will get its value from inputs.image. If I scroll up, I can see that inputs.image currently has a placeholder, since this is just example data. But when I actually execute this action, this will contain the value that the user provided when executing the action. So I can see that if I scroll further down, I can see that under image, I got string, which means that the expression that I used here is valid, and it is indeed what I want to see here. Besides image, we also provided environment in the same way. We just took another one of the inputs. And lastly, we sent the run ID, because we're going to want to use it in the backend to interact with this execution. So as we can see, all three pieces of data have the expected value from the sample data. So it looks like our payload is good, and we are ready to proceed. So let's go ahead and click Done. Now, before proceeding to the last step, let's take a look at the workflow itself. So I'll head back to GitHub. Let's open up the workflow and see what it does. So first of all, important to note that under inputs, we can see the three pieces of data that we defined in the payload, so with the same name as the keys in the payload. So this is how Port knows to forward this data over to GitHub. And now in this workflow, we can just access this data using regular GitHub syntax. So let's see what's going on here. The first thing we're going to do is use Port's GitHub action, and we're going to use that to send a log message over to Port, notifying that we have started the deployment of the image. So you can see the log message here. We're going to say that we started deploying the image, and we're going to use the inputs for this log message. Now, as you can see here, we're using two secrets that you need to set in your GitHub repo, the Port client ID and client secret. To obtain them, simply go to your portal, click on the three dots icon here, and choose Credentials. Here you can see client ID and client secret. Simply copy them, copy their values, and set them as secrets in your repo. So going back to the workflow, once we've done that, the next step would be to actually add your deployment logic. Now, this of course is different depending on your environment and the tools you use, etc. But this is where you would add another action or another piece of your workflow and run your logic there. And then finally, we're going to call Port's GitHub action again, notifying that we have finished deploying. So we have image deployed successfully. And another thing that we did here is we used the link key, which we did not use the first time. But just to show you what can be done with this, you can add links to send back to Port, to the action run object. So here I just added a link to our docs just as an example, but you could of course add here any links to logs that are relevant to this run, or anything else that you would like to quickly access from this action executions page in Port. So now that we understand what this looks like, let's head back to Port and continue setting up our action, and we'll proceed to the final step. So clicking on Next here will take me to the Permissions tab, the final step. So here we have some permissions that we can control regarding this action. Let's start with the first section, execution. So here we can define who can execute this action. We can manually select users in our organization. We can manually select teams in our organization. We can also toggle this on to give everyone access, making this just a public action in our organization. And lastly, we have the service owners toggle. So in port, entities can have teams assigned to them as properties. If I turn this toggle on, then only teams that are assigned to this specific entity on which we are executing the action, only they will be able to execute it. So in our case, let's just turn this on and make this just a public action. The next section talks about manual approval. So sometimes we have sensitive actions that we want each execution of these actions to be manually approved by someone. So we can turn manual approval on. Here we can define how approvers are notified. So we can notify approvers by email, Slack, or webhook. And the next step would be to say who these approvers are. So again, we can choose specific users, we could choose specific teams. And here we can define whether all designated approvers need to approve this, or is just one of them enough. So we have a lot of granular control over this. Lastly, we can just toggle this on, saying that only admins, only users with the admin role can approve this action. So let's leave this with no manual approval for our example and go ahead and create the action. So our action is ready. Let's go ahead and execute it. So I'm going back to the self-service page, and if I scroll down to my day 2 operations, I can see the new action we created. So let's go ahead and hit execute. So the first thing we need is to select a service on which to run this. So let's just take demo service, and we need to provide values for the inputs that we defined. So let's just give some example value, and say we want to deploy this to production. Fill those in, hit execute. Now when you execute an action in port, this little toast message pops up, and you can click on view details to go directly to the action run page. So this is the page that summarizes all the data related to this specific execution of the action. So we can see that the run is in progress. We can already see the logs that we defined in the workflow now being printed here. If I refresh this, awesome. We can see that the action finished successfully. Again, this success status was taken from the GitHub workflow. And remember that in the last message we sent, we also attached a link. So it was an example link to our docs, but just to show you that links that you send back will appear here under job links, and you can send multiple ones. And this is just a handy way to, again, direct users to any external logs or any external source of information that is relevant to this execution. So this was just an example. So there you have it. Congrats on creating your first action in port. Hopefully you now have a better understanding of how actions work. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can create much more complex actions covering much more creative and useful use cases. So thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.